It is Monday, or rather Tuesday. Let me flip my calendar. July the 16th, and welcome to week 3 of realities in criminal justice issues. And we're going to take some time today, and we're going to share some details. And I told you I'm going to take some time today to cover or discuss a little bit about the O.J. Simpson case. I have a timeline that I want to share with you as well. So let's go ahead and get started, and let's get right into sharing my screen. As you can see, this is the information that usually you see. And I'm going to go all the way down and remind you that our next lecture will be next week. That will be week 4. Be aware of the fact that after this week, we are at midterm. And that when we get to week 4, and we start doing week 4, assignments for week 1, 2, and 3 will not be accepted unless I have previously made some arrangements with you. So if you have some issues, you need to reach out to me before week 4, because after that, I will not be accepting those assignments, and you need to be on top of that as well. If you have any questions about the project and you're having troubles, some of you have reached out to me, and I've responded back to you. Let me know. So let's look at our announcement for week 3. So today, high versus low profile cases, and the reading involved the O.J. Simpson trial, which I'll be discussing, and then discretion, politics, and public interest in high profile criminal investigations. And then complete the activity, media coverage of high and low profile cases. Your initial posts are due tonight by 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. Your reply posts are due Saturday, 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. And then finally, make sure that, well, you complete the activity media coverage in high-profile cases. And be aware of the fact that the discussion assignment does evidence make a case. So the media coverage of high and low profile cases is an activity that you can look at. So tonight, your initial post for does evidence make a case is due by 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. And then your reply post is due Saturday, 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. Finally, be sure to complete the written assignment, fair trial, or paradise lost. And some of you have asked about that. You can find details in Google concerning that as well. But you want to make sure that you do complete the assignment following the details in the rubric. And then your course project, create your interview questions, which we've already shared with you. And then you know that they're in the rubric, and I'll go over that. And then complete the mid-quarter student survey at the end of the week or sometime next week. And you know about my motto, adversity is a springboard to success. Okay? So now I want to bring this, come over here. And let's look at the course calendar. Okay, you see this is where we are right here. And your initial post, as I talked about, is due tonight. Your reply post is due Saturday. And then your written assignments are due on Sunday, and including your keyword or phrase that you're going to have for the assignment. Okay? So now let's go right into the module itself. And let's look at the assignments again. So there's a synopsis of the Paradise Lost video, and you're going to take a look at that, and then write a 1 to 2 page paper identifying a minimum of 3 issues relating to a fair trial of the defendants in the Paradise Lost documentary, but it has to do with media coverage and the investigation, and conclude your paper with an evaluation of how much impact the media had on this trial. Make sure you come and click on this, the due date, the 21st, the rubric. Again, it tells you you will get 80 points. Paper identifies at least 3 issues ensuring a fair trial after media attention. You get 40 points for that. And then evaluate the impact that media had on the trial. You get 40 points. And then these are standard on citations, references, cover pages, and so forth. So you want to make sure that you run your papers through Grammarly as well. So I'm going to go back. Get this out of the way. And then let's go back to the next written assignment. And then, do you think the O.J. Simpson case was tried in the media? Or do you think the system worked properly? And how much responsibility should the media take for the outcome of this case? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight from a perspective that I had to deal with back when it happened. And I went back and I found a timeline that I can use to make this flow for you. And you're going to answer these questions in your initial post, and then deal with them in your reply post. And then finally, your course project, where you're creating interview questions. Now, by now, you have selected the newspaper media source that you're going to use, TV, or whatever it is you're using, and you provided that, because I will be grading that coming up this week, as well as now you also provided the PIO, Public Information Officer, for the organization, whether it's the police department or whomever it is that you're dealing with here in terms of your paper. And be sure that you complete a total of 20, 10 for each interviewee. So 10 for the PIO and 10 for the media person. And in creating these questions, you are preparing for the interview that will be coming up. All right, so I want to see these questions, and I want to know which questions are for the PIO. I want to know which ones are for the media person. First, include the 4 mandatory questions listed below for both interviews. So both of them should be asked these questions along with, then you'll have some other questions. Next, create an additional 6 questions for each of the interviewees, okay? So you should have 2 sets of 10, okay, including the 4 mandatory and the 6 questions you created. So it'll be these 4 plus 6 for the PIO, these 4 plus 6 for the media person. Okay, so ask open-ended questions. What open-ended questions are? Questions that don't require a yes or no answer, but questions that give the ability of the individual to provide details concerning what they do. And you're going to ask questions about the relationship between the media and the criminal justice professionals that they work with. And so you're going to work hard on this. Now, I will tell you right now that I'm not going to be so dogmatic about citations, but I am going to be dealing with those when you actually use those in terms of your interviews themselves. So, but I do want you to understand that it is important for you to follow the requirements of the rubric. Again, here it is. Submitted the 4 mandatory questions for both, 45 points, and 6 additional original questions for each interview. You get 45 points, and all questions are relevant to the profession of the individuals that are involved. And then the content information there. All right. Any questions? Feel free to reach out to me concerning that. Now, just remember that it's not you don't have to provide the answers, because you're going to get those in the interview, but you're going to submit questions and list them. You know, the PIO 1 to 4, 1 to 10, and then the newspaper person, or vice versa, whichever order you want to do that. Okay, and those are your assignments for the week, and you already know when they're due, and then of course your live classroom, and then complete the survey. So now let's go into the actual lesson content. And we're going to deal with the media coverage, and we're going to deal, as I said, specifically, I'm going to talk a little bit about the O.J. Simpson case and my experience with that. So we've covered this, and this. So we're going to talk about right now media coverage involving. As you should be aware of, is that the media does have an impact upon how some cases operate, and high-profile cases like the O.J. Simpson case, and then dealing with the investigation of the Joan Benet Ramsey. And those of you who don't know about that, that's a case that actually never really went to court, but it's an investigation that involves a little girl who disappeared and was murdered, and never really it's still open, and it's unsolved as of my last recollection. And so the media had this all over, and so the question is that when an individual is high profile, like for example dealing with O.J. Simpson, this is an example of a case because the individual is a public figure and they come to trial, and the media has a responsibility to provide information and details concerning what's going on. And the question that's asked oftentimes is, does that interfere with the rights of that individual at trial, particularly when you start dealing with juries involved? Well, it's been quite clear that that's not necessarily the case, and you're going to see dealing with, if you take a look at this article here, professional athletes held to a higher standard. Very interesting law journal. If you read that, you'll find some details. But the public now, because of the fact that there is court TV, they didn't have that before, and cameras are allowed in the courtrooms. The public is able to see a lot of things. But the preliminary issues about what's happening in the investigation are viewed by the public, and people are going to draw their conclusions. But the bottom line is that when the case gets to the point of jurors being selected, because we have what we call voir dire, or a time when they ask questions, you get these little things like this, and I'm gonna just hold it up right here. This is a questionnaire that I have right here that was just sent to me, and for jury duty. So I don't know what case I'm going to end up on, or if I'm going to end up on a case. More than likely I won't when they get through finding out my experiences in life. But jurors are selected by the voters list and things of that nature. So the question is, does the star draw the media, or does the media make the person a star. It could be either way. It could be either way. The JonBenet Ramsey situation, JonBenet Ramsey's family, they were not in the public's eye. O.J. Simpson was, on the other hand, in the public's eye because he was a very well-known athlete that's involved. So you have individuals that become famous or known because of the incident that happened, or they become known by something that they had done prior to that, like such as O.J., who played professional football. Then you have individuals like, for example, R. Kelly, who's been tried, and now he's up again in a federal case involving sex and underage girls, and it's going on. But he was famous first because of his music and his musical talents, and because of his star power. Some of these things, they say, occurred, and so now the public is entitled to know, you know, what is going on in these kind of situations. So in this situation here, dealing with R. Kelly, this is an individual that I personally have had some experience with. He went to high school with my daughters, and I remember him when he was in high school. And then I remember when he broke and became famous, when he came out with the song, I Believe I Can Fly. And then he went on and became a rock star and, you know, made a bunch of money. And so in the course of that, he's been tried already once and was found not guilty some years ago. And so now there are currently two issues going on the state as well as on the federal level. So the bottom line is that people are going to want to know about these trials. Another example is a situation that involved the Laquan McDonald case of the 16 shots that were involved, and there was a lot of media coverage about what happened, but it was the media coverage, as I've previously shared with you guys, that brought out the truth about what really happened, and that the testimony in court utilized the information that came. And so the jurors, while they were familiar with the video spoke for itself, and people could look at it and determine and hear the testimony of all sides there. So it depends. It depends. Celebrity status has impact on the media, and the media has an impact on celebrity status. But at the heart of this issue, is it the fact that a person can get a trial, like, for example, in the O.J. case, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, based upon the fact that there's a lot of money that the wealthy have, and they can afford big-time lawyers. Like now we have this Epstein case that is taking place down in Florida, and people are going to be watching that situation and what occurred down there. But it's a lot of money, and he's going to be able, he's already put together a high-powered legal team to defend him, and added other individuals, as has R. Kelly. So the public likes to know what's going on with celebrities, and that the coverage was basically, the precedent was set for all of this with the O.J. Simpson case. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that in just a short period of time. So because we have a presumption of innocence, it says that if the justice system existed in a vacuum that was not influenced by outside opinions and information, that would be easy. However, it says with the influence of the media, the general public often forms their opinions about defendants before the trial begins. And the question is that fair? Well, again, the bottom line is because of the system that we have for selecting individuals who actually will hear the case, the media position is probably going to be either a friend to the defense or an enemy to the defense. It could be a friend to the prosecution or a defense or an enemy to the prosecution. And so when you take a look at how the media has now reached a stage where cameras are allowed in the courtroom, and I have for years thought it would be nice to have cameras in courtrooms. I represented a young man in a high-profile case, and it was pretty tough. There were no cameras in the courtroom. There was some pretrial publicity, but the evidence that convicted this young man really didn't, the media coverage was null. It was based upon the evidence that was presented. So a lot of people think that when you deal with celebrity cases that they should control the amount of information. Well, the question is this: not just celebrity cases, but all cases. And I talked to you and shared with you information about the Sam Shepard case, where there was an excessive amount of pretrial publicity, and publicity that came about even during the trial, where I'm getting some background noise. And so we find ourselves in a situation where you cannot take information and you cannot judge what's happening based on information that's taking place out of the media. So it's going to have to come back to the point in dealing with the information that comes out during trial. And so when you find yourself, and sorry about that, I'm getting a little too much background noise here. And so the public, again, has their right to know, and the defendant has their right to a fair trial. And so the bottom line here is this: it says, if all Americans have the right to a fair trial, it should also include celebrities. But often, because of their fame, they're treated differently and sometimes treated unfairly. So there was a whole question about that in many, many cases. But usually the argument is not so much that. The argument boils more down on how they have the money to be able to afford high-profile, high-powered legal defense teams, and that the average individual doesn't. So to be honest with you, in my experience of having been a defense attorney many years, I don't think that, with the exception of that Sam Shepard case and maybe a couple others, that Casey Anthony case, looking at that, those are different. But most cases where the public is able to see and pretrial evidence, then what happens in the courtroom kind of like sets it off. And unfortunately, here's what happens. Because the public sees what they see maybe in some of the TV coverage, and if there is a case that the media covers, that the court case is on television, as O.J. Simpson case was, then that's a rare thing, and nobody really wants to see most of the average cases. But the cases that involve a whole lot of community issues, or either there's some individual who's famous and well known, then in that case the media will cover it, and I don't think that their coverage actually changes anything. It's the ability of the individual to have the bucks to pay for the attorneys. So having said all of that, I want to go now, and I want to stop sharing this. and I want to go back, and I want to share with you some content. And I want to share a file so we can start talking about it. Give me a minute while I pull it up. Here we go. Okay, it's loading up. Okay. So I want to talk about the O.J. Simpson case. And you can see here from what you're looking at is that it started on June 12, 1994 with the investigation and how Mr. Simpson was notified about the murders, and then there were funerals, and so he was arrested in June 17th, and you all of you may have heard or may not have heard, if you've seen the movies or the videos, that he was involved in the what we call the infamous chase, the Bronco chase, where he was in the car driven by his friend Cowlings, A.T. Cowlings, and then he returned home, and then he was taken into custody. Then you see that the trial actually begins to get going with the first step on June 24th, where the grand jury recused, and then there was starting in July 6-day preliminary hearings where there was determination that it was sufficient evidence and probable cause brought for O.J. Simpson to stand trial on 2 counts of first-degree murder relating to Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, who were found stabbed to death at their home in Rockingham. And then Mr. Simpson pled not guilty, and Judge Lance Ito was assigned to the case. And there were many preliminary motions, of which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but the defense of O.J. Simpson had established what we call the Dream Team, which consists of Johnny Cochran, who ultimately was the lead attorney, Robert Shapiro, who was another attorney, and then there was the main ones. Well, also you should be aware of the fact that Mr. Kardashian, Robert Kardashian, was also one of the attorneys that was involved on the case. And those of you who know about the Kardashians now, that's their father, and he is the guy that if you ever see the video of the verdict at the end, you see a look on his face like he's like stunned by the video and what happened. But anyway, the bottom line is that these were just a few of the attorneys. And they had some specialists in DNA. They also had a noted attorney, F. Lee Bailey. F. Lee Bailey was a noted criminal defense lawyer from Massachusetts, and he was brought on to the team. They had about 8 or 9 lawyers, but the main ones I have mentioned so far. And so one of the things that happens in cases is that motions are filed to obtain records of all the potential witnesses and so forth. There was a motion to sequester the jury, which gets to the point that you see that happened September 2nd, 1994. And the point of that was to make sure that the jury that is selected based on the questions and the voir dire, which was made public, that they were asked questions and determine whether or not they would be able to be fair and impartial in terms of hearing the case. And this was a case that originally, early on, and that it was announced that the death penalty would not be sought. And so there were a whole lot of motions concerning the search of Mr. Simpson's home. The jury panel consisted of 8 black, 1 white, 1 Hispanic, and 2 mixed individuals. 8 women and 4 men, of which alternates were selected. And so the point of the matter is that I can tell you I had an opportunity to cover this case for 3 radio stations in Chicago during that period. And I had an opportunity to get to know Johnny Cochran 10 years before that, but I was shocked when I saw that he was the attorney that was representing OJ, and he was very, very detailed. I'm going to talk about him in just a few minutes, but I want to get you an idea so you understand what the makeup was. Now, as I talk about this case, then I'm going to talk about some other aspects of it. I'm just right now laying out the timeline for you. So the jurors were selected. There was DNA evidence. The defendants waived that. So that was just one of the motions. And of course, the jury was sequestered on hearing held on the admissibility of domestic abuse evidence. So things like that were not things that the jurors were able to hear. Prosecutors were involved in a lot of, one of the ones I never forget, and I remember this one, this January 13th date, where Christopher Darden, who was one of the prosecutors along with Marsha Clark, and Johnny Cochran, the lead attorney, were arguing over racist language regarding the upcoming testimony of Mark Furman. Now, let me explain something to you so that you understand how this whole thing, the dynamic worked. As the team was selected as far as the defense attorneys were concerned, originally Robert Shapiro was the lead, and then Johnny Cochran was brought on. Now, Johnny Cochran had a reputation as being an individual who was, by the way, at one point a prosecutor early on in his career, and he was not treated fairly by the police. And Johnny Cochran was known as an attorney who represented individuals who had been, how should I say, not treated fairly by the LA Police Department. And so he came on as a person who would be able to put some light to the fact that Mr. Simpson, and it was established pretty clearly that there were some racial issues that were going to be involved in this case. And so Johnny Cochran was the ideal person to be the one to deal with that. And it would become ultimately clear when we get to the testimony of Detective Mark Furman, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. So there were some racial issues from the outset. There's some DNA that comes into this case, but it doesn't play as big a role because DNA was pretty new at that time. It wasn't used a whole lot, and to determine whose blood and what kind of blood was involved here. So anyway, as I studied this case, and I appreciate, I got this from one of the law schools that had this timeline, which I said, this is perfect, so I want to use this for you guys. Johnny Cochran, of course, being the lead attorney, did his opening statements. Johnny Cochran, very eloquent. You can go online and you can see many of his comments that he made during the opening statement for the defense. And he portrayed the defendant, O.J. Simpson, as an individual who was, how should I say, another black person that the LAPD were out to get. And that's pretty much what it was all about. And so that's why also the prosecution went and got Christopher Darden, a black attorney, to sit on the prosecution side to try to neutralize that racial issue, but wasn't very successful because of the testimony that takes place, and you'll see what I'm talking about in a minute. And then there was a book that came out. You know, I saw the book. I have the book in my library. I read the book. It was something that I would not have a client to do. But anyway, the book was published about it. And so, now remember, this wasn't the media. This was O.J. doing himself. So anyway, there was testimony about abuse and violence. Jurors actually took trips to go to the Simpson home and to view the crime scene itself. Now, I'm showing you something that what's happening in the courtroom is helping to shape this decision, but because it was such a, O.J. was such a high-profile figure, being a professional athlete and a noted athlete, as well as a movie star. He had been in several movies. He was in the Police Squad series. He was also in several other things, and then he was noted for the Hertz commercials running through the airport. Some of you, if you go back, you'll see those. So anyway, there was a trip that was taken to the Simpson house. Now, in March, when the case was really starting to really get interesting, Detective Mark Furman was one of the police officers who gathered information and details. And Mark Furman was known as an individual who didn't particularly care for minorities, especially African Americans. And so noted defense attorney F. Lee Bailey from Boston, he actually was questioned, that Mark Furman, about whether or not he used the N-word and whether he had. And the detective, I recall very clearly as I sat there listening, he said he's never used those words. And my mouth flew open. I said, that's going to come back to haunt him. I already knew it would. And so as we continue to move forward in the case, saving that information, there was a criminologist that LAPD brought, Dennis Fung. He said, and this is some of the things that came out under cross-examination by Barry Shank. Barry Shank was a DNA expert, and that was his. He said he got the criminologist to admit that there were procedural errors, and talked about things such as after the 3 sheriffs that were involved in the case were reassigned, there were juror protests. It was all kinds of issues. A wrongful death suit was filed even while the case was going on. And then the DNA testimony comes about. And one of the scenes that Johnny Cochran used later in his closing argument happened from May 15th, where Mr. Simpson tried on the glove. When he tried on the bloody glove, and the glove didn't fit. Well, I pointed out when I was doing my comments to the public, and I was remembering that day, I remember one of the things that I said, of course the bloody gloves wouldn't fit, because in order to wear the bloody gloves, you had to wear plastic under it because they were bloody, and you didn't want to be contaminated with that, and it was leather, and it would cause the gloves to shrink. And so it would not fit. And so later on, the famous line comes about that Johnny Cochran gives in his closing argument, if the gloves don't fit, you must acquit, which was fashionable for a defense attorney to use things that were produced during the trial. And so that was a strong point. And so the defense calls OJ's daughter as a witness, and she testifies about her dad. Then there was some possible conflict of interest issues concerning the judge, and the prosecution asked, not the defense, asked the judge to recuse himself, but she changes her mind. But it's out there. Let me explain something to you. That was a bad move on her part because, as I shared with the public back in those days, I said that what was it that he was picking up that they didn't want him to be aware of, and there was no reason to ask for his recusal. Anyway, the fact of the matter is that that was one of the boners I think that the prosecution made. Just one of them. There are many, many, many more. So bear with me as I go through this. And so here's what happens now. You remember what I told you about Mark Furman testifying that he had never used the N-word? And so anyway, in order to determine whether the tapes could be used, the tapes were played with the jury absent. And then the judge ruled that the jury could hear 2 of the excerpts. And the jury then, a few days later, get a chance to hear the excerpts. And so, and then on this next day, the day after they heard the excerpts, Mr. Furman, without the jury being present, because they were very careful about making sure this was a fair trial. And Mark Furman, the detective now in this, refuses to answer questions, citing his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. There we go, people. This is the LAPD. And see, let me tell you something. Again, it wasn't really just the money that he had a dream team, Mr. Simpson, but you also had some cops, and the prosecutors weren't very smart with how they handled this case. So people should understand that part about it. There's some racial issues which I'll comment at the end, but I'm bringing you to the point that, and so anyway, it was made clear that after that, and see that gave some speed to the defense attorney when Furman does that, because we already know what happened is he was the jury had heard him that he did in fact use the N-word. So he, as a police officer, which is what I've said many times to my law enforcement students, is that once your credibility is shot, you got a problem with the trier of fact. In this case, that's what happened in this case. And so the defense announced in September that Mr. Simpson wouldn't be testifying, and the defense asked the judge to instruct the jury as to reason for Furman's further non-appearance, and the judge agreed, but the prosecution objected. Remember, who produced Furman in the case in the first place? Not the defense. It was the prosecution. And so it as they say, put a black eye on their case. And like I said, Christopher Darden was brought in to try to neutralize that, but it wasn't strong enough to do so. And so there were appeals. even to the appellate court concerning the judge's instructions, but the court said, nope, he didn't do anything wrong. So the prosecution was, as they say, how shall I say it, treading in deep water with sharks in there, and there was some blood. And I'm not talking about in the physical sense. It was that the defense could come in for the kill. And so September the 11th of 95, the defense, as it says, refuses to rest their case due to the unsolved question of the instructions on the jury concerning Furman, and then Judge Ito orders the prosecution to begin its rebuttal. Well, the prosecution did conditionally rest. Now, this is a very interesting point. I already told you about Furman. Now I want to talk about Detective Van Adder, who was a piece of work here. Detective Van Adder was cross-examined by Robert Shapiro on statements that he had made concerning mob informants and by why the police went to OJ's residence. And then during the point, one of the things that came out, and if you saw that little transcript that we had in our classroom, one of the things that happened that I never forget, a big boo-boo when it comes to evidence. The shoes that were taken from the scene. Detective Van Adder took the shoes, put the shoes in his trunk, and instead of going to turn them in, as you do with evidence to keep the chain of custody intact, he instead takes it and puts it in his trunk for the weekend and then turns it in after that. And that evidence came out. And that was like, okay, what's that all about? That's not even professional. That's not the normal policy. So the police bungled the investigation, basically, you discover here. So anyway, finally on the 21st of 95, defense and prosecution, they rest their cases. And in a statement to Judge waiving his right to testify, Simpson says, I did not, could not, and would not have committed this crime. And then the judge gives the jury instructions to the jury. And then closing arguments are delivered by the prosecution. And then the next day, the 27th and 28th, Johnny Cochran and Schenck deliver defense closing arguments. Cochran makes his controversial statement to the jury, and if you ever go and see the video, there's a nice video I was looking at earlier where Johnny Cochran compared Mark Furman to Hitler and how his whole attitude was as a law enforcement officer, and that was during closing argument. And you know, when you're doing closing argument, people, you can express your views and opinions. The prosecution can try to object, but they make themselves look bad when they do so. So we came here to 1995, September the 27th, and then the case goes to the jury on a couple of days later. And from September 29th to October 2nd, the jury deliberated, and it actually came out that the jurors most of the jurors were returning a not guilty, but because you have to have a unanimous verdict or either a hung jury, they continue to deliberate. So after less than 4 hours on the 2nd of October, the jury said they reached a verdict. On the 3rd, the next day, O.J. Simpson was found not guilty of 2 counts of murder. Now, backing up to the closing argument, the point of the matter is, and I'm not going to talk about the civil case because that's where it goes in from here. Notice, though, the jury in the civil case consists of 9 whites. Did you hear me? And 1 black and 1 Hispanic. That was the civil trial. And you know what happened in the criminal trial is that O.J. Simpson was found not guilty, and going back again, the jury panel consisted of 8 blacks, 1 white, 1 Hispanic, and 2 mixed. Why am I saying this? I'm pointing out to you that unfortunately what happens is that race does play a factor in this case. And you should be aware of the fact that when Johnny Cochran gave his eloquent closing argument about Mark Fuhrman, and one other key thing that many people know that came about because of what I said earlier about O.J. With the glove, is that, remember the famous line, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. And then Johnny had the glove on, and you remember he had the hat on too, the skull cap on. Johnny was an attorney that presented picture words. That's the way I was. I learned a lot from being under people like him and other noted criminal defense attorneys. But I can tell you this, that the trial itself, in terms of the media coverage, it had to take place because of the fact that it was unfortunate that race came out as a big issue involving this case. During that time, it was quite clear there were people who were interviewed, and it was pretty much divided among racial lines whether or not O.J. got away with something or that he actually did it. And so it stands as a sad commentary about our judicial system that race did play a role. In reality, it's like the elephant in the room type situation, and people should be aware of that. And as I said, it clearly demonstrates itself when you see the difference in the criminal trial where he was found not guilty, and it was primarily African-American jury, and the opposite was in the civil case. Only 1 black and only 1 Hispanic and only 1 person of Asian or African ancestry. And so this time, you know, in this court case, it's preponderance of the evidence. In the criminal case, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. And so anyway, the bottom line is that the jury finds Simpson liable and awards $8.5 million in damages, and the rest is history in terms of dealing with the wrongful death issue. And so I am I'm going to stop sharing this because of the fact that I want to make it clear to you that what you learn is that this case was really one that found itself, whoops, I think I lost you. Here we go, we're back. We find it's in a situation here where the answers to the questions that are asked in the assignment regarding O.J. Simpson is, it wasn't the media covered. The media just provided an opportunity for people to see what happened in the courtroom. It was a combination of some race issues and the police themselves bungling up the job. Detective Van Adder, and also the way that they handled the DNA evidence, the expert Barry Shank coming in and making it pretty clear that that there was some mess up with the DNA. And so DNA wasn't really a strong factor in this. I would say to you guys this, to be honest with you, that even with the race issue involved, because it was very strong, it was during that era. See, many of you guys were very young. I mean, that case took place in '95. Okay, this is 2019, so it's been over 20 years. So you got 95, 2005, 2015, nearly 24 years ago. And so I'm telling you that that was a case that yours truly had the opportunity to learn a lot of insight on that I've shared with you today. And I think that when you look at this case, again, there's and unfortunately, people, with the way that this country is headed with the leadership that we have now, we can have this same problem continuing, and not just cases like that, but like the Laquan McDonald case, and any other cases that pretty much come up where African American and Caucasian involved, where you have law enforcement involved, and law enforcement has to learn to do the proper things in order to get a decision. It is not just that OJ had money to pay a dream team, but again, it's clear from the evidence that was produced in the courtroom, which came from the stand, that there were some bad police work that took place, terrible police work, and was not the best. And as a result, Mr. Simpson, the jury, based on the race issue, based on the fact that they did apparently they were out to get him, and they did eventually get him financially. And you know the rest now. You know he's out from serving with the other trial that took place about him getting his stuff back. So, well, with that, I'm going to say good night to you. The key phrase is something that we've been talking about the whole time. O.J. Simpson. That's it. You give me that, and you'll get your points. So with that, I'm going to say good night to you, and I hope that you have learned some things that you might not have thought about concerning the O.J. Simpson case. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. There's a whole lot more. I just gave you the summary using that outline, and also some other things that I'm aware of. So I'm going to say good night to you, and have a good week.